tonight. To kick the evening off, I would like to bring up somebody who is the Chief Development Officer for the Excellence in Mental Health Foundation, and her name is Jana Jacobs. Jana began her journey in the mental health field as an art therapy student at UC Santa Cruz, writing her own major in art therapy. A field study internship at Sotira House evolved into a full-time job there. And 30 years later, after working in clinical services and program administration for the county mental health system, Jana brings her skills and experience to the Excellence team, where she helps donors realize their philanthropic vision through donor-advised and incubator funds, and provides assistance and oversight to the grantees. She holds a master's degree in psychology and counseling from UC San Francisco, and please give her a warm, warm welcome. Jana Jacobs.
Very good synopsis. Thank you, Mitchell. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. I don't usually public speak, so I'm a little nervous, but I just want to say it's an honor for me to be here. I basically read Bob's other book, The Anatomy of an Epidemic, and it pretty much confirmed my clinical life experience. I started in an alternative model, and I always knew the work we did with first episode psychosis back in the 70s, where we had a house that was a research project, and I saw people get well without the traditional medical model. At that time, the pharmaceutical companies were coming out, and they thought the big hope that they were going to be able to come up with a medication that would actually help people. Here we are 40 years later, and research and finding out people are actually dying 25 years younger, and they're not recovered. And then I heard about this foundation that actually Bob also inspired a large group of people, of researchers and professionals around the world who had also read his book, and we all said, what can we do? And so the idea came to start a foundation, and that through private money, every dollar, it doesn't have to be, philanthropy always sounds like multimillionaires, it's not. But we thought we wanted to be able to fund research that was unbiased and didn't have pharmaceutical or commercial interests. And I got asked to join the foundation, partly because of my Soteria background, and I was pretty passionate about continuing 30 years in the public sector and being rather frustrated. So I said, okay, I'm gonna jump the government job and I'm gonna go work for what I really believe in. And I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't read Robert Whitaker's book. And so it's really kind of a personal honor for me to get to introduce him, because he's sort of been my hero, and now he's a friend. And then his partner, Lisa, and with their latest book that they're here primarily to talk with you about tonight, Psychiatry Under the Influence. So I think you're all very lucky to be here, because he's become, in a lot of ways, a superstar for people with lived experience who no one's given a voice, and a credible voice, to their journeys. And there's lots of people out there who we don't hear about, but they have recovered from living and working and getting treated in the psychiatric system, and they've moved on to live very productive lives. And we know that recovery, we believe at our foundation that it's possible, and I know Bob does, and there's just some amazing people, and we need to give more voice, and we need to have more people hearing about this. And so for the purpose of kind of public education, welcome and spread the word, and I hope you enjoy what you hear tonight, and stay after. If you want to hear more about the foundation and the work we're doing, I'd be happy to talk with you individually, so hang out afterwards and introduce yourself to me. And with that, I'm going to introduce Bob. I hope you all read Bob and Lisa. There's a little bio in the flyer that came out, and I didn't want to bore you all with repeating everything in it, but they both met at the Safra Institute at Harvard, which is a special institute where they were both fellows on very in-depth investigative study, which I think is what produced this book. And Bob had been a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize on some of his work with science and medicine and the history of health in the industry. And Lisa is a professor and psychologist at UMass. So you've got some pretty amazing people here tonight. So here we go.
Please come. Come on. Come here. Please. Come here.
He's the man. He's the man.
Anyway, first of all, Mitchell, thank you for having us here. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I was saying it's rare when you see a bookstore like this. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen a bookstore like this. So you're all really lucky to have a bookstore like this. It's incredible, really. We were saying when we came in, it won the Bookstore of the Year award from the Publishers Weekly. So really great to be here. I do want to thank Steve and Sarah for bringing us here and so making this possible. Thank you. So here's what we're going to do. I'll talk a little bit about how psychiatry and influence, what its main theme is, a little bit then about how I came to be part of this, and then turn it over to Lisa, and then we'll come back. So really, psychiatry and the influence in terms of its big theme is we know today that there's a...
You're going to talk about anatomy.
I'm going to. Just let me go. I'm going to get back. I'm just going to set up anatomy, okay? This is what the collaboration was like. So imagine writing a book like this. Anyway, the big theme, and we'll get into it, but it's just we know that psychiatry has become such an influential part in our society. I mean, in terms of number of people diagnosed, number of people taking psychiatric drugs, and this whole thing has really happened in the last 35 years. And so what this book looks at in so much is what was the story in society that really supported this incredible explosion of the psychiatric enterprise, and then really looking at whether the story is a scientific story or a commercial story, and also has it benefited society or not. So that's the big themes. Now, my own path to writing this book with Lisa was we come from two different backgrounds. I come from a journalistic background. She comes from an academic background. So my path was this, and you'll see how it fits into the story. So in 1998, I was doing a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And at that time, I had a completely conventional view of psychiatry. My understanding was we're making great progress in understanding the biology of mental disorders, the biology of schizophrenia. My understanding was that we had discovered that these disorders were due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and that we now had drugs that fix those chemical imbalances in the brain. And that is a metaphor that is, that's a very powerful metaphor. That metaphor tells of an incredible advance. Because think about how complicated the brain is. I mean, the brain is so complicated. And now the understanding was, and my understanding as a newspaper reporter was, well, depression is due to too little serotonin. Schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. And if that is so, that would be one of the great medical advances of the 20th century. I mean, think about like insulin for diabetes. When you think about great medical advances, you come to understand the pathology, and then you develop an antidote for that pathology. And that's what we were being told was, and that's what I wrote. That's what we had come to understand. But what happened was when I was doing that Boston Globe series, and one of the context of this series for the Boston Globe, which was a series on the abuses of patients in psychiatric research settings, was we actually looked at studies in which they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients, and we said that's unethical because the drugs are like insulin for diabetes. They fix a chemical imbalance. You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic, so why would you withdraw an antipsychotic from a schizophrenia patient? So absolutely conventional understanding. But what happened was when I was doing that series is I came upon two studies that began to question that conventional wisdom. One was a study done by Harvard researchers that looked at schizophrenia outcomes for the past 100 years, and they actually found that schizophrenia outcomes had worsened in the last 15 years, and were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. So that belied this story of progress. And then I came upon these studies done by the World Health Organization, in which they compared outcomes in 3 poor countries or developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the US and 6 other developed countries. And each time they found that outcomes were much better in the poor countries of the world. And specifically India and Nigeria. And they concluded that, listen to this, living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. So I said, well, why would that be? I mean, it seemed like such an amazing failure to have this as a predictor. And one of the things for me to start moving away from this conventional understanding is when I read the WHO studies, and I had just published a series, co-written a series saying everybody needs to be on these antipsychotics forever. They found that in the poor countries, they used the medications differently. They used them acutely, but not chronically. And this began to say, well, wait a minute, I thought this fixed the chemical imbalance. Anyway, I wrote a book called Mad in America, really meant to investigate the failure of treating people seriously mentally ill, diagnosed with schizophrenia. This failure of why living in a developed country would be a predictor you won't do well. It's such a tragedy, right? And then this is a very controversial place to be. Psychiatry is a very controversial world. And after I finished that book, my agent said, don't ever write about psychiatry again. Just go away. And so I wrote a couple other books. But then people were coming up to me and saying, like, well, what's happening to the kids being medicated, especially long-term, and what's happening with people with depression long-term, and where are all the bipolar patients coming from? So that led to writing this book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. And what Anatomy of an Epidemic did that I think was new to this dialogue was that it looked at, well, what is science telling us about the long-term effects of psychiatric medications? So the psychiatric medications get approved because they're better than placebo over the short term in reducing whatever the target symptom is. But those studies are like 6 weeks. And what you really want to know is how you're going to be doing after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Is this form of care really going to increase the likelihood? That's all you can say, because there's all sorts of spectrum of outcomes. Is it going to increase the likelihood you're going to be doing well longer term? And what you really find in Anatomy of an Epidemic was when you investigate the history of science by mainstream researchers into that question about how medications affect people long term, is you actually see a lot of evidence that they're increasing the chronicity of the disorder. So in other words, lowering recovery rates. Now that does not mean nobody's doing well on the medications, but whenever you think about whether a medication, how it's affecting people long term, you have to say, well, what's the natural recovery rate for that disorder? And then your intervention, the therapy, needs to improve on that, or otherwise, if fewer people are recovering, you're actually lowering the recovery rate. It doesn't mean that nobody's recovering. And what you see, unfortunately, even with psychosis and schizophrenia, you see that on the whole, you're seeing the people who stay on medications ending up more chronically psychotic, more chronically depressed than the unmedicated group, which is, of course, contrary to what you think is true. That's why the book was controversial. But the point was, this is what mainstream literature was showing, mainstream science conducted over the past 50 years. And when you look at long-term outcomes, it really argues for is a rethinking of how you use the medications on a more sort of selective model instead of a one-size-fits-all model. So I did that book. As Johanna said, it did stir a lot of discussion around and interest even by researchers about, okay, maybe we need to rethink this paradigm of care. And shortly after that, Lisa contacted me, and Lisa's been, and I'm going to turn it over to her really quickly, but she's been doing a lot of research in this field as well, and she had become part of a research lab at Harvard University studying institutional corruption, which is really looking at how institutions with a public mission, what are the forces that cause them to betray that public mission, and then what is the social injury, and why don't the people within that institution recognize what's going on, and then look at prescriptions for reform. So she invited me to join her in this lab to look at psychiatry through this lens, the institution of psychiatry through this lens of institutional corruption, which led to this book, Psychiatry Under the Influence. And what I think is so great about this lens, it really illuminates why psychiatry has sort of, why do we get the psychiatry we have today? In other words, over the past 35 years, how did this institution become so influential in our society? Because it has reshaped childhood, it has reshaped old age, how we deal with grief. It's really been an extraordinary society-changing institution. The question is, how did that come to be? So now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
So all I'm going to do is tell you a couple funny stories and then turn it back to Bob, because I'm aware of the fact that it's almost 9 on a Saturday night and there's wine and food back there.
But I won't shut up is the point.
So you might wonder about the collaboration. That's a funny thing, wouldn't you say?
Go on.
So one of the jokes is that we could sell a lot more books if we YouTubed the arguments over the books, because Bob's an English major and I'm an academic. So it was basically every sentence. You want to say raked in? No, you say earned. And then the question that I love the best, the response, when someone says, are you going to write another book together? We will not write so much as a thank you note together after this. But in all seriousness, I would just say, before I turn it back over to you, that what I hope for the book and what I see for the book is a little bit different, in that I always say I'm not anti-medication, I'm not anti-psychiatry, and what I see the lens of institutional corruption doing is it shifts the focus from the bad apple to the bad barrel. It's a systemic approach, and in that regard, I hope that it engages disparate communities in dialogue, as opposed to saying, are you pro-psychiatry, are you anti-psychiatry, are you pro-drugs, are you anti-drugs, and it focuses on solutions and solutions for reform. So the robustness that I see of the conceptual and normative framework of institutional corruption is that systemic socio-political focus that shifts us away from an us or them. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so you're going to let me present the book. All right. So here's what it is. So the idea is, okay, first of all, you identify what is the public mission, what is the public thing that it's supposed to do. So psychiatry, of course, is supposed to serve the patients, as any medical specialty is supposed to do. And what we did in this book, Psychiatry Under the Influence, is we really looked at the conduct of psychiatry since 1980 forward. And the reason we focused on 1980 is this is the year that the American Psychiatric Association publishes the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this is a watershed moment in American history. Jeffrey Lieberman, a recent past president of the American Psychiatric Association, called DSM-3 maybe the most important book that's been published in the last 50 years in the United States. Not the most important psychiatric book, the most important book. And I agree. DSM-3 is the most important book published in the United States in the last 50, 60 years. It has changed our society in such a profound way. So why is it so profound? If you look at the first 2 editions of the DSM, so the American Psychiatric Association is as a medical specialty, is the one that sets these diagnostic guidelines, right? And in essence, from the diagnostic guidelines, you get a conception of what is going on with psychiatric disorders. So in DSM-1 and DSM-2, if you really go into them, there was really 2 parts to the DSM. There was a core group, there's this core group of biological disorders, of schizophrenia and maybe manic depressive illness, although they were seen as having a psychological component as well because of Freudian influences. And then there was this vast group of neurotic disorders. And the neurotic disorders was the walking wounded, the people, not in hospitals, but struggling with anxiety, depression, those sort of things. But if you have psychological disorders, and even schizophrenia, if you read about it, and these more severe disorders were seen as having a psychological component, then your therapy is not going to be just drug therapy. It's going to be, of course, as well as psychological therapy, what's happened to people in life, that sort of thing. But in 1980, that conception is going to change. And what they're going to do with DSM-3, they're going to adopt what they call a medical model. I call it a disease model. And now they're going to say, if you have these symptoms, well, then you have a disease. We're going to conceive of depression as a disease. Or we're going to conceive of anxiety as a disease. And what this does, it converts all these walking wounded people with psychological problems into people with brain disorders, okay? And once you have this change in conception, what's going to happen? Once you move from psychological problems to brain disorders, what's going to be the first line treatment for brain disorders? It's going to be drugs.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
What do you think was the impetus for that?
Well, we're going to get to that.
Because I think what you think is the impetus, I don't think is the only impetus.
Well, you go ahead.
No.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. There's two impetuses in which we talk about in the book. One, there is a scientific impetus, but there's also a guild impetus. There's both. So if you look at psychiatry in the 1970s, there was a group at Washington University who was saying, like, we don't really know anything about these disorders, and we need to group them together in a different way to really do research. So we don't have a good diagnostic manual. Our manual really doesn't cleave disorders at the joints. And so they came up with the idea of basically setting grouping people with the same symptoms into like 15 to 20 different research categories. And the idea was, we don't know the problem, okay? But if we group together people by symptoms, we can study this group and start to see, is there an underlying pathology that is similar to these people? What's the course of these different disorders like schizophrenia, manic depressive illness? So there was a sense, a real scientific sense, that the existing manual wasn't reliable. It didn't group people together into like like-minded groups. And there was a famous famous thing done by a psychologist named Rosenhand. What was Rosenhand's first name? It was a study in which they sent a psychologist at Stanford sent some of his students into a number of different mental hospitals and emergency rooms, and they complained of thud. They're hearing a voice, one word, thud. And they all got diagnosed with schizophrenia and admitted, and then, what's that? And the point was, when they published this, it was sort of an embarrassment for the American Psychiatric Association that they really did not have a good manual, okay? So the scientific impulse behind writing a new manual was that DSM-1 and DSM-2 did not meet the normal criteria for diagnostic manual, which means it's supposed to be reliable. You go to the same doctor and you get the same diagnosis. And it's also supposed to be valid, meaning whatever it is a real disorder. So there was this scientific impulse, but the scientific impulse was, we don't know anything about these disorders, and it was meant to be a research manual. But at the same time that is the impetus for redoing the manual, you have these guild interests. So what's happening to psychiatry in the 1970s? Well, one, there are all these groups threatening the legitimacy of psychiatry. There's anti-psychiatry groups coming from academia. There's ex-patients coming from hospitals calling themselves survivors of psychiatry. In other words, not that they were helped, but they survived psychiatry. You have this sort of intellectual embarrassment that came from this study, this published study about which said psychiatry can't distinguish insanity from sanity. And then the other thing was, so you had all these challenges to psychiatry's legitimacy and its legitimacy as a medical specialty. And you can go into the documents at the time, and psychiatry is saying, we're fighting for our lives. We're in a crisis state. We're in a state of emergency. Maybe psychiatry will not survive. And the final thing was this. They're in competition for the walking wounded with with psychologists, social workers. And so what did psychiatry say? What's going to save us? Well, we're going to...
Wouldn't you say that it's more complicated than that?
No, I wouldn't. But go ahead.
I just don't think it's that either or. I think the impetus, the person who was the head of the DSM-3 was Spitzer, and his mother actually suffered from horrible depression and was treated by a psychoanalyst. And I think that's important information. So he really wanted, I think the impetus, part of the impetus, did it segue into, a wrong direction? Yes. But the impetus really came, I think, from wanting to develop a scientific manual and not from a Machiavellian, we want to develop a manual that will allow drugs to be. I think they played handmaid into industry, but I think the impetus was more scientific. But do you disagree?
Yeah.
Okay. You can see why we should YouTube our fights. Oh, that's okay.
No, okay.
He's the man.
Yeah, no, honestly, we do see this differently. I mean, I think there's documents you can even see where they'll say, like, how are we going to survive ourselves? And they'll say, well, what's the image in American society that is so respected? It's the doctor in the white coat. And they also said, what distinguishes us from the psychologists. It's our prescribing powers. That's what we have in the marketplace that gives us this advantage. And you can even read then once they publish DSM-3 and they now adopt this disease model, you can see in editorials they say now we're going to rally around the flag.
I think was scientific. How they marketed it was clearly commercial.
Okay, yeah, all right. So I think there's two impetuses. I think there's a guild interest and there's a scientific impulse. But what happens is in 1980, if you read DSM-3, they say these are hypotheses. We don't have evidence that these constructs, these 290, there's no science behind these different constructs. We don't know what is real. And the idea was by grouping them, these are hypotheses, and hopefully we will validate them over time, okay? That's what you see in the manual. That is the hope. But what happens? What happens is psychiatry now, the American Psychiatric Association, starts marketing this new story to the United States, to the population, this new disease model. And they set up a PR machinery to do this. It's a new organization. They began holding every year things to basically tell this new story to the media as well. They hold media training days. They also start holding days where they train psychiatrists what to say to the public about this new disease model. But when they tell this story to the public, it's not about hypotheses. It's about we're discovering things, that we're starting to make these discoveries that these are true diseases of the brain. And you start hearing now, we start hearing that, we're discovering that this mental disorders are due to faulty chemistry in the brain, chemical imbalances. So rather than present this story as a hypothesis, they began presenting it as an advance in science. Now, the next step, okay, when you look in this institutional corruption, you look at what there's called the economies of influence that start acting on that institution. So what you can see with 1980, with this, the new DSM, what two economies of influence are going to start acting on American Psychiatric Association? Well, one, it's going to be the pharmaceutical industry. Because, of course, now you're going to make all these walking wounded basically a potential market for antidepressants and anti-anxiety agents, that sort of thing. So we tracked the amount of money now flowing to the American Psychiatric Association starts going up the minute this happens. There's this change in conception. That's.
I would just interrupt here and say that I think one of the things that makes psychiatry more vulnerable than other medical specialties is the fact that there are no biological markers for any disorder in the DSM. Most people, I think, would assume if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, surely there's a scanning technique, something. There's nothing. So yes, is oncology, is cardiology vulnerable? Yes, but there are biological markers. There aren't any in psychiatry. So it's that, I think, in itself renders it far more vulnerable to industry influence.
So, this one? Okay, you just have to put it up close. So, we trace the money that goes to the American Psychiatric Association. They start funding everything, even this like training of psychiatrists of what to say. They're training that. But then the second thing that happens that is so key is they begin to capture academic psychiatry. And what does this mean? It means they start hiring academic psychiatrists to be their speakers, advisors, to conduct the research, etc. Now, academic psychiatrists, in the same way as academic physicians, they're known as your thought leaders in society, your opinion leaders. These are the very people we trust to tell us about what is known about the biology, the efficacy of drugs, that sort of thing. But now money is flowing from the drug companies to individual psychiatrists to be their speakers and advisors. And in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association makes a really key change. Prior to this time, at their annual meetings, the pharmaceutical companies were allowed to have exhibits, regular exhibits at the conference, but they weren't allowed to sponsor symposiums, scientific symposiums. But with this change in 1980, the pharmaceutical companies could begin sponsoring scientific talks at the annual meeting. And who gave those talks? The academic psychiatrists. So everybody in the audience is seeing Joe Blow from Harvard University with all that prestige, right? But in fact, those talks were rehearsed. They're being paid by pharmaceutical companies. So this begins the capturing, when institutional corruption, of the very voice in American society that we're trusting to give us the honest information about what is being learned about diagnoses, the biology of disorders, the effectiveness of drugs. So you can see now, and this is one of the ideas of institutional corruption, what are the economies of influence that start capturing the individuals within that institution, and rather than serving the public, they're going to start serving these other economic interests. And the other thing here is, though, so if we look at the economies of influence, there's pharma money capturing the American Psychiatric Association. There's pharma money capturing the thought leaders. So that's one influence. But then you have the own guild influence, the American Psychiatric Association, which sees itself in competition with psychologists, social workers. They now have a disease model to promote. So there's that guild interest that's going to affect what they say. So now in this book, having identified these economies of influence, our next step is to look at how it corrupts the storytelling. How it corrupts the storytelling around what have they learned about the biology of mental disorders. We can get into the chemical imbalance story. How does it corrupt what is told about the efficacy of drugs when the new drugs are tested? How does it affect the expansion of diagnostic boundaries? Because think about this. If you can expand the boundaries, invite people more in, that's going to expand guild influence, but also the pharmaceutical companies.
Do you want to give some specific examples? Because that might help.
Yeah. And then finally, the clinical practice guidelines, what the recommendations. So go ahead with the
Oh,
boundaries.
no, I was just going to talk about different, so expansion. So grief is effectively a disorder in the grief is effectively a disorder in the DSM-5. Previously, everyone knew if you lost a loved one, that's a sad part in your life, and you might present with typical symptoms of depression, but you would not be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. One of the changes in the DSM-5 is that now, even after just 2 weeks, if you've lost a loved one and you present with symptoms of depression, you can be diagnosed with depression. Another change that I think is a good example is binge eating disorder. You only need 3 symptoms. If you've eaten more rapidly, eaten when you weren't hungry, and kept eating when you were uncomfortably full. Now, is that a problem? Yes, but couldn't we all say that we've done that occasionally? And I don't think we should see it as an individual disorder. So I think those are just to give it some.
Yeah, these are just the latest, actually. So the big ones, actually, if you go back to 1980, was depression. So depression always was seen as having 2 types. There was one type, a small group, that was seen as really sort of a serious disorder that probably was biological. But that was safe. And the idea of depression as a disease, endogenous, was that it was out of sync with the context, okay, of life, and it went on too long. But they eliminated that. Now if you just have these symptoms of not sleeping too much or whatever, the context was removed. And the minute you removed the context, you suddenly took all these people who were having contextual problems, divorces, losing jobs, all the difficulties of life. That sort of distress, which used to be seen as, just part of life, got moved into the disease category. And
although the attempt was to disrupt that dichotomy of endogenous and exogenous, because we don't know the
right, but that
reason,
dichotomy went back to Aristotle. So I'm just, but the point is, this is what opened up the antidepressant market. And how about ADHD? There was no ADHD prior to 1980, and this is the first time it gets constructed. And then what you can follow is, when they first construct ADD in 1980, they say, about 3% of kids. Then with DSM-4, they make it easier to diagnose, and now they say 5%. And next thing you know, people who are getting paid by drug companies to help promote this are saying, no, it's 6 to 10%. And one of the people who's very famous for helping build the ADHD market is someone named Joseph Biederman from Massachusetts General Hospital. Now you know that more than 10% of American youth are diagnosed. Well, Joseph Biederman had contracts with 24 different pharmaceutical companies, and every single one that was a manufacturer of stimulant medications for ADHD. So that's an example in which you look at a diagnosis gets created, and then the people who help expand it and tell the public that it's been validated, who they're going to get rewarded for by the drug companies, and it tells you how markets are built.
No, do you want to just say a couple solutions and then open it up? Because it is 9, and people are probably...
Okay. Well, just let me just go on prattle just for 2 seconds. If you go through these different parts here, just to put this illumination of this sort of framework for, go to the chemical imbalance story, that whole theory of mental disorders, because this is so key. You look at now about 80% of Americans believe that depression is due to low serotonin, right? And this is such a powerful conception of being, a philosophy of being, is that we're sort of the victims, or we're ruled by our neurotransmitters, right? Well, if you actually investigate that key story that has really governed our understanding of psychiatric disorders since 1980, you find that it arose from an understanding not of what was happening to, say, to depressed people. In other words, did they find that depressed people have low serotonin? But rather than it came out of an understanding of the mechanism of action of the drug. So, for example, they came to understand that antidepressants up serotonergic levels in the brain. So they hypothesized that depression is due to low serotonin. Okay, this goes back to the 60s. But now they have to investigate. Do they find that people with depression in fact have low serotonin before they go on the drugs? And we think they did, but they didn't. As early as 1983, you see the NIMH saying, we're just not finding that a lesion in the serotonergic system is a primary cause of depression. In 1998, you see the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook saying, this was sort of a flawed thought anyway. There's no reason that the pathology has to be the opposite of the mechanism of action. And you see, for example, Kenneth Kendler in 2005, who was one of the big investigators of the chemical imbalance theory, saying, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations and have not found them. So you see the betrayal here? The betrayal is that a story was promoted to the public about chemical imbalances, about drugs that fix chemical imbalances, when in fact they didn't find that to be so. And the moral obligation, of course, of any medical specialty is, of course, truth and honesty. And if you don't know something, you have to say, we just don't know. And just to finish this up, so what do you see? You see a false story being told about what is known about the pathology of disorders. Now that story really helps sell drugs. It also helps validate these disorders. We find out that's not to be true. Then when you look at the new drugs that came on market, which were like Prozac and then the new atypicals, they're heralded as so much safer and more effective than the old drugs, but you actually see the data, it's not true. They're really no better than the ones before. Then you can go into this, you can chart as these expansion of boundaries, and Lisa's done this research. The people who were involved at the American Psychiatric Association in setting the diagnostic guidelines, they were also consultants to the drug companies, so you see that conflict. Then if you go in, and again, Lisa's done this work about, if you look at clinical practice guidelines, you compare clinical practice guidelines in the United States for depression compared to the other countries. They're much more drug-oriented. Then you look at who's on the clinical practice guidelines, and you see that those people have conflicts. So what you really see here, and this is what we try to put in Psychiatry and Influence, is there's been a story told that our society has organized itself around, including about how we treat children, how we deal with grief, that sort of thing. And then when you look at the science, you see that the science is not there to support this story. So the tragedy is that we as a society have organized ourselves around a false story. And then you go in terms of this illumination, you look, what's the social injury? Well, you see rising problems of disability. If you see kids being diagnosed, what's happening to them when they're 18, you see all sorts of problems. So you do not see a reduced burden of mental illness, you see an increase. And then we can, as we go through this, then what we do in this book is also look at cognitive dissonance as to why don't people within the institution see this. And then in prescriptions for reform, finally, so because I think this personally, and Lisa can talk about this. Okay.
Open it up.
Okay, I will finish. I think this has changed our society. I think this corruption is so profound. It's changed how we raise our kids. It's changed how we view ourselves, our capacity for resilience, and how we should organize in helping each other when they're in distress, social justice issues, because think about foster care kids. We say that the problem is the foster care kid now as opposed to, what happened to that kid. So I think this is one of the most pressing social issues out there is this false story that has been presented. And then the question is, what do we do? What do you do? What does society do? Because it's really a societal issue. And now she's going, please be quiet.
No, it's just late, and I'd rather open it up to questions. I mean, I have ideas for reform, but it's late.
What is your biggest surprise from the audience reaction after the book compared to before the book?
Go ahead. No, you go. You're good.
So here's the thing that I have experienced. People feel betrayed. The biggest thing is how can we as a society have organized ourselves around a story that is so easily proven not scientific? And people on an individual level have often made many, many decisions based around that false story, and they feel frankly betrayed. So from my point of view, the real experience has been the sense of like, how did this happen? And the sense of the harm that it comes from organizing yourself around a story that can be proven false.
I would just say something a little bit different, just because I deal with students all the time, and so it would be not so much just complete betrayal, not that either or thing, but what can we do about it, and how can we also incorporate the voices of people who feel like medication has helped, and how do we create a space for appreciating all lived experience, people who've been on medication and who found it very helpful, and how can we understand that?
Just as a follow-up to that, as you watch the news and you see, for example, a psychiatrist that is an officer goes to the army and slaughters those people, this jihadi psychiatrist, and then you see this kid that was on medication with his mother, shoots his mother, goes to the kindergarten and slaughters the whole kindergarten. You see time and time again, this guy that went to the theater was on medication, he forgot them, he didn't forget them, goes and kills a bunch of people, and he gets this defense, what is it called?
Insanity.
Insanity, and you see it time and time again. And this is exactly supporting your hypothesis. So what can we do in the future?
Well, here's my thing about the whole sense of relationship possibility of psychiatric medications and psychiatric treatment to violence and all. We have made that it's off limits to society. In terms of we do not have a wide-scale societal discussion about this. It's not talked about. It's not investigated. So we don't really have an investigation in all these killings about, are they on meds? Are they coming off meds? Have they had psychiatric care? Instead, the societal discussion is focused around, if we just had everybody medicated, we wouldn't be having this problem. But this is part of the problem, is that, in my opinion, is rather than having a full-scale societal investigation of these things, is there a link here? It's off limits, and it's off limits because of commercial pressures.
I would just add from a research perspective that I think what we need to do is design trials that would allow us to understand adverse events like violence better. We know that antidepressants, we know the side effect profile of SSRIs pretty well because they've been on the market for so long. So a trial designed in the public's interest would have a more robust adverse event design, and we don't do that at all. We do a very passive ascertainment of adverse effects. So from a research perspective, that's what we could do.
But we need an investigation.
So have you suggested that to American Psychiatric Association?
Yes, I've suggested many things to the American Psychiatric Association.
And what is the answer?
They haven't really responded in a very positive way, to say the least.
No,
Yes.
what do they say when they don't respond in positive way? What exactly are they saying?
The last study that I published, the president of the American Psychiatric Association took out a press release and basically said that our data was flawed. So it doesn't even get to the level of a conversation. It becomes more of an attack that isn't conducive, in my humble opinion, to science. So we haven't gotten to the point of, okay, here's a solution of a dialogue, right? Which is why, that's where Bob and I differ. That's why I'm always saying, I'm not anti-psychiatry, I'm not anti-medication, because if we just preach to the choir, nothing changes. It's great to preach to the choir, but...
Just for the record, I'm not anti-psychiatry, and I'm not anti-medication. I think the whole question is you need to have it illuminated by science, okay? I believe, but go ahead. We're going to go here and then here.
I just have one comment. Is if you looked at the press, you saw Coca-Cola funding a lot of the studies from nutrition. And then they found out that they got millions of dollars, these universities. So that's number one. Number two is I spoke to a friend who's a psychiatrist at University of California in San Francisco, and I asked him one time, I think there's a gene for happiness. If you look at like the Latins, I think they're happier. Why don't you do some studies about happiness? And his response to me, drug companies don't fund those type of studies. So you can hear that. So the question is what have you found is effective? Because a lot of times we've had even mentioned, I don't remember that psychiatrist, he talked about were you here that night? He was raving about psychiatry and how psychiatry helps everyone, and it's poo-poo. People are embarrassed. It was like his version. People are embarrassed by psychiatry. They don't want to bring their kid to a psychiatrist. It has like a notion of my kid is mental. We have to put him away and things like that. But what is the effectiveness? Because that's what I'm always thinking about. In your studies and in your work, what has been effective in psychiatry? Let's look at the positive. What can they do? What can they help?
Well, to me, again, it gets back to informed consent. I think, and maybe we differ, maybe we're the same here, but I would say that true informed consent would be to tell someone, if they were going to be prescribed an antidepressant, look, we don't know for whom the drug works or why. And if someone wants to take it, given that, that's fine, because it does, when you're doing means, not to get into the nerdy part that I get into, but you're looking at means, so you can't ever say, will it work for this person? And our research is not yet robust enough to address those individual differences. So I think, the solution would be, in terms of informed consent, to say that to someone. And I believe if someone chooses, for whatever reason in their history or whatever, that they would want to take a psychotropic medication, that's fine. So I wouldn't say that they shouldn't take it.
But they wouldn't be able to predict that in advance.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
Let me give you...
With it's like with an antibiotic. If actually, when we go to our PCPs, if they say, look, we really don't know if it's bacterial or viral. We know if it's bacterial, it'll work for you. If it's viral, it won't. You want to take it? Take it. That would be true informed consent. And maybe some PCPs say that. So I think it would be analogous to that kind of statement.
Well, let me give you an example of a solution that you can see out there that's involved. What I really like about this solution, in fact, it does find a place for the medications. It's just very different. So there's a program in northern Finland called Open Dialogue Therapy. And going back to 1992, they really changed their thinking about schizophrenia and psychosis. And basically what they did in northern Finland, they said is, well, first of all, we don't know what's wrong. Okay, there was this humility. Mm-hmm. And then second, they said, we're not going to conceive of the problem as just in the person's head. We're going to conceive of it in the in-between spaces of people. So you have to heal family relations, and you have to build connections to friends and that sort of thing. And so since they conceive it as not a brain illness to be cured by a drug, but this sort of social thing as well, and it's not that there might not be something biological. Here's how they use the drugs. They initially actually do not put people on antipsychotics, and they began doing this in 1992. And they wanted to see, is there some part of the group, can they get them through the psychotic episode without putting them on the antipsychotics? And sure enough, they found over time they could do that. Now, they used benzodiazepines to help restore sleep-wake. So now they have one group gets through the psychotic episode, and then rather than becoming a chronic mental patient, they go back to society, right? Now, there's another group that they found after a little bit of time is not getting better, and they put them on antipsychotics, and many people are helped by that. And then of that group that is put on antipsychotics, some they taper off, and then some they end up on full-time on the antipsychotics. So what is it? It's a selective use model. It's a best use of model. What you're figuring out here is for whom and for how long, which actually is a core value in medicine. In other words, you try to figure out who benefits and for whom and for how long. And they've developed this protocol to do that, and they now have had the best outcomes in the Western world. And here's their outcomes in northern Finland with their first episode psychotic patients. At the end of 5 years, 80% of their first episode patients are working or back in school. Only 20% have gone on to become chronically ill. Now, how about their medication use? This is a group that's it's all about best use, not anti. 67% of their patients have never gone on antipsychotics. With this intensive psychosocial care up front, they're able to actually get them through the psychotic episode and sort of back out the door. Then there's another 13% that have used the antipsychotics for a temporary time, found them beneficial. And then there's a 20% group that, in fact, is on them long term, okay? So it's a best use model. Now, you asked about solutions. One of the things that so pleased me, so I wrote about this open dialogue and anatomy of an epidemic. But the point was, A, it wasn't seen as anti-drug, and 2, it had a research history to it. And now actually there are these open dialogue pilot projects, replication projects happening in the US, UK, Germany, et cetera, because it speaks of a better way. One of the things that Jana was talking about, this foundation, is they've actually done some funding of replication projects in the United States. That's one of the reasons was for the foundation to set up. So we learn about a better way. Let's see if we can do it here. And so that's an example of a form of care that's born of humility. That's number 1. We don't know. 2, it is born of a commonality. What do we all need? Well, we all need a place to be. We need someone to love us. Jobs, meaning are really important. And they're saying everyone needs that, okay? And then they have a way to use the drugs in a selective manner. So in terms of on a protocol way, that's what I think we need. We need these selective use protocols. A, we need humility. We don't know the problems with the biology. Selective use protocols. And I do think in a sort of reconception of psychiatric disorders, to go back to sort of a common humanity sense. What do we all need to stay well? We need love. We need to love somebody. Exercise is helpful. Diet is helpful. And restore those, and then we can figure out the proper use of the medication as a tool.
I'll just end on a nerdy note, although that would be a better note to end on. But a nerdy note would be, you might not know this, but there are different phases of clinical trials to determine whether medications work, all medications. And unfortunately, the last phase, phase 4, is all funded by industry. And that's the longer term effect. Some of you might have heard of Vioxx and the Vioxx scandal, and the problem is that industry funds all of phase 4 long-term research. And so why would a pharmaceutical company or medical device manufacturer in any way be incentivized to find out that their medical device or their great blockbuster drug has bad side effects or isn't as efficacious? They're not. And so what we need to do is figure out ways to fund phase 4 research so that truly independent research can be done. That's a nerdy answer. I like Bob's answer, but you've all hung in so long.
No, we'll get some time for other questions. Go ahead.
You mentioned that Latins are usually happy. I have my own experience. My mother, we're from Cuba. I was born in Cuba. During the 60s, when I had was conscious of her, she was always very anxious, which was understandable from things that were happening there. And we all catered to her, I mean, from my father, and she was treated with anti-anxiety drugs, which were very common in Cuba. This happened for a number of years. We left Cuba in the 60s. There was plenty of anxiety in all these episodes. And we went to Puerto Rico. She lived in Puerto Rico. She kept having these episodes, and she was still being treated with that type of Ativan, for example, and that type of drugs. In the 80s, she moved. I moved before to Miami, but in the 80s, she moved to
started, she was really, really very, very bad at that time. And then she was finally diagnosed with depression. And she was they started trying different antidepressants. Prozac was out in those days, Paxil, things went like on a roller coaster until finally with Effexor they were able to treat her and they were able to, she's 94 now, so it's been since the late 80s, because the 80s were crazy when she moved to Miami. But after that, they were able to treat her, and there has been tests, like they test her blood to see so there is some good
Yes, absolutely.
in the drugs, because
Yes.
let me tell you,
Yes.
my sister and I, we keep going back in life and say, oh my God, it was a crazy life. My father, God bless him, he's up there and he doesn't want her to get there. We say it all the time, he's resting. It was all about her.
Yeah.
Our whole family thing was about her. She would get, and we left Cuba and we went through Jamaica and we were all, trying to make things happen, and she was always out of control.
And the Effexor was helpful.
The Effexor finally did it. And like I said, she's 94, she's still on Effexor.
And that's what we hope our book does, is that it
good in
yes,
no
absolutely,
ways.
and it doesn't take this
And not all
anti.
daddies are perfect, and not all daddies are happy.
Can I ask a quick question? It strikes me that what you're talking about, the influence of big pharma, is not just simply an issue of psychiatry, because big pharma obviously plays the same role in almost every aspect of medicine.
Right.
In order to, there was a scandal at the University of Miami about someone who came on board who was being influenced by big pharma in terms of the tests that
The
they were doing.
psychiatrist, the director of the psychiatry.
Was it psychiatry? Yeah. But it's also happening in other areas, in cancer therapy. The history of cancer treatment over the course of has been that as well. So and also the insurance companies. The one thing that I hear often from people in the world of psychiatry or psychology is, yeah, sure, we'd love to do longer treatment of a speaking kind, as what you talked about, but insurance companies aren't paying for that anymore. And maybe it's because of the DSM. Maybe it's because they're saying that what they ought to be doing is just giving them drugs, and that's it. We'll give you a week's worth of therapy and prescribe you drugs, and that's all we're going to pay you. So speak a little bit about how the psychiatry aspect of it fits into the broader scheme of the abuses of big pharma and our insurance companies as well.
Sure, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I have an NIH grant that's looking at the clinical practice guidelines internationally. And while it's easy for me to say, based on pilot data, that NICE, for example, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, they are far less drug-oriented. They advocate for exercise, et cetera. And that's true, but you need to look at it in terms of larger context. And if you look at their healthcare system, that needs to be paid attention to. So I haven't personally studied the influence of third-party reimbursers, but in some ways, I think I should rightly be criticized for comparing apples and oranges when I look at different clinical practice guidelines in different countries. The healthcare system absolutely matters, and I think our healthcare system is one which has a perverse incentive structure that incentivizes pharmacological interventions for a variety of quote, disorders, as opposed to, quote, lifestyle interventions.
So you've not actually, the two of you have not researched the role of insurance companies?
No, no. I mean, I think that in terms of, no, I have not researched the role of insurance companies, but you can certainly see it. I mean, there's two parts to this. I mean, it's not just psychiatry that's created markets for their drugs. I mean, you can lower what's the standard for, yeah, so you see all these things.
Well, it's only the United States and New Zealand that have direct-to-consumer advertising. So that tells you if all the other countries in the world don't do it, there's a reason they don't do it.
But
There's a reason we do it. It's because the lobby is so
And then you
strong.
hear all these diseases that they never knew were wrong.
And what role will ICD-10 now play? Because you have DSM-5, and starting October, we have started using the ICD codes. So will that make any difference?
I don't think so, because with each iteration of the DSM, there's been increasing congruence with each iteration of the ICD. So you see a great congruence between ICD-9 and now ICD-10 and DSM-5. So I don't think it'll make. Oh, sorry.
Oh, well, just in terms of the insurance bit was so I hear this complaint all the time too. We'd like to do talk therapy, but they only pay us for 15 minutes. Well, they're only going to pay you for 15 minutes because that's the story they told. The story they told was that the medications were so effective, so why should they pay for an hour? So they created their own box. Insurance companies they're just being responsive to the story that was told. Insurance companies want to do whatever's cheaper and the most effective, basically, and it's so often. And then, we also live in this sort of magic bullet culture, and that influences the drug companies as well, that there's a pill for every ill.
And that everything has to be expedited.
Yeah, so
Such time to heal, like you were saying, for the grief process, and the diagnosis is given right away. So the grief process sometimes takes 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes maybe even longer, and that's not taking place. Insurance companies do interfere in that they say, well, we will not pay after so many number of sessions. My concern has been with not only just the diagnostic code, because insurance companies also require diagnostic codes. So I don't know, have you looked into American Psychological Association and what are they doing about it? Because, American Psychological Association is for psychologists, so that is therapy. And it has nothing to do with medication, because we can't prescribe medicines as a psychologist. You have to have an MD, not a PhD or a psyche. Have you looked into that? Have you talked to American Psychological Association?
Well, I haven't talked to them, but there's the same sort of guild bias and interests at play. So you look at publications by psychologists on RCTs of psychotherapy, and guess what you find? Psychotherapy is efficacious. And
Generally, they say
so,
that for schizophrenia and other disorders, a combination of therapy and medication has been seen as the most successful mode of treatment. So psychologists are not going to say that don't prescribe medicine. They're going to say if
Exactly.
it's necessary, then that's if a patient comes to me, I'm going to evaluate and say, I think that you also need to consult a psychiatrist besides doing psychotherapy, if that is needed, because I'm not an expert in medication. That's not my area of expertise, so I have to refer it to someone.
yeah, we have our own confirmatory biases that undermine.
I just want to say two things on this. Going back. One of the reasons for DSM-3, in fact, was the insurance companies in the 70s weren't willing they're saying, why should we be paying for the psychiatrist talk therapy? You have no evidence you're any more effective than the social worker. So why should we be paying, an hour that's very expensive for a doctor that's no better than here? So this was one of the guild interests, actually, was to satisfy the insurance companies, and once they have a disease model, that's more sellable to the insurance company, because in fact they want to pay for diseases. They do not want to pay for general unhappiness. So that they don't. This is part of the story behind this and how this whole box was built. Now, this whole thing about psychotherapy plus medication, I have to say that needs to be put under the microscope too. And the other thing that we're talking about here is there are short-term effects, and then what are the long-term effects? And for example, I'll just tell you, when I hear was it your mom's story? It's great she's got Effexor, and it's working for her. Fantastic. But on the other hand, we don't know what your mother's life might have been like if she hadn't gone down the medication route with the anti-anxiety agents in the first place.
I think there was a dose of addiction, and I think that was also.
So when we as a societal point of view try to say, how we should use these medications. It's great you have your anecdotal story about your mom. I'm glad she's found this. But maybe if she would have never gone down the benzodiazepine route, she would have never ended up a lifelong patient. Yeah, and these are part of the larger complex questions that society needs to think about.
What about the natural environment? Why can't people find, be able to relax and not be immediately put on medication, but take a walk through the woods or take a walk down the beach? I've run a nature center here in Miami for 23 years and have watched lots of little children with ADHD, and they come off the school bus just like pushing and shoving and jumping and doing all things. And when they leave us 3 or 4 hours later, they are so calm and complacent. And why is that not a solution to some children's problems, that their parents just take them and have a run on the beach or a run in the woods?
It is a solution in other countries. Again, just
But why not in America? I mean, we see so many children on, we get given the medication packet, like at 11 o'clock, give the child this, at 1 o'clock, give the child this. And I see, as a director, I don't think they really need those drugs.
I think that, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
I think because in the United States, there's the guild interest that Bob talked about, as well as the pharma influence. And I think in terms of clinical practice guidelines, again, this is a nerdy, not good soundbite response, but it's true. In other countries, governments have methodologists who have no skin in the game. They crunch the numbers. And when you look at like the APA's guidelines, they're all psychiatrists. They have skin in the game, and they believe in the efficacy of medications. So you need to have methodologists who are developing the guidelines that just look at the data. And when you do that, what I see with the clinical practice guidelines are ones that advocate for exercise, that advocate, non-drug. Yes, exactly.
But this is the tragedy. This is the tragedy. And basically, if we go back to 1980s, they conceived of fidgety kids not doing well in school, or as well as their parents like, as a disease. And then once they say it's a brain disease, then you're going to treat with a drug, right? I mean, that's sort of the natural response. And yet you see something totally different. Yeah. And I would say in the history of mankind, we know that these things make a difference, right? And that being out in nature is lovely. And there was an article, this is the tragedy. But you can ask why. Does anybody profit from sending kids out in the wilderness for four hours? But do you profit by sending a kid on ADHD medication? Does someone make some money? There's part your answer to. By the way, the New York Times had an article the other day about they're now prescribing antipsychotics to like 1-year-olds.
Under 2, it was 20,000 in the year 2014, and it doubled from the year 2013 for children in the crib, under 2 years old. And they said they were treating them for aggressive behavior. Really.
Let me go from one end of the spectrum to another one. Let me talk about my grandchildren. What I see here is you said something about the undeveloped countries and our country. Our country has become so obsessed with having these children do so well. At least I see it in my family. It's an obsession. My 3 kids, they are constantly checking. I don't remember doing that with my own kids, checking their grades, checking their homework, checking. It's like an obsession. And then, of course, one of them doesn't do as well as they expect them to do. It's like they want all of them to go to Harvard. It's just ridiculous. And then one of them doesn't do as well as one of them is already in medication because that thought that she couldn't concentrate. I don't want to say anything, but I think it's an obsessive disorder from the parents, not the kids.
Right.
It's culture. It's our culture now, at least in Miami, I see it. It's very sad. It's sad.
We probably should let you drink some wine.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank both of our guests, and I want to thank you for coming. Yes, please do. Thank you, Steve and Sarah, and thank you, Yana. And hang out. You know, we have some wine. We can talk some more. And when you're tired of talking, you can go out in the courtyard, listen to some music, and just calm down a little bit.